Sustainability doesn't cost money. If you can think about things in terms of a more holistic approach, sustainability could and should actually save you money and make you
Mm,
more effective and efficient in the long run.
mm.
Efficiency and effectiveness have long been the foundations of a successful supply chain, and that's exactly what drives sustainability. I just think that sustainability sometimes has a bad rap of being a PR tactic or just for regulatory requirements.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Jen. Jen, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Jen Chu. I'm the Vice President for Solutions and Consulting at Bristlecone. We're a supply chain services company, and we help Global 2000 companies deal with planning, procurement, and logistics challenges. And really excited to be here with you today.
Fantastic. And what was your journey to where you are today in Bristlecone, Jen?
Oh, it's been a long one. I've been doing supply chain and advisory work in one capacity or another now for 30 years. I started doing SAP work with Price Waterhouse before it was even PwC back in the day. So now I've completely dated myself in all sorts of verifiable ways. But yeah, it did start with SAP as a foundation, like so many of us in supply chain have. It really seems to be a common backbone for so many large companies. I
Guilty.
also, yes, exactly. I spent time at Forrester Research leading their enterprise applications research stream. So, writing about SAP and Oracle, and also writing about manufacturing and supply chain as one of the focus areas because it was such a big part of the ERP focus area. Most recently, I spent 8 years at TCS in their consulting and services integration practice and leading a big transformation effort there, helping TCS to become more consultative in its interaction with its large clients. And so that intersection of supply chain and consulting and transformation really was the reason why I ended up at Bristlecone, because that's exactly the type of services that they provide to their clients.
Interesting. And all along that journey, what do you think has surprised you the most?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting how often some of the same challenges keep coming up over and over again, whether or not the specific technology changes or the news story of the day that gets everybody wound up. It really all comes back to you've got to address the people, the process, the data, and the tech issues in collaboration with each other. Dealing with one at the expense of the other just never works out. So I guess it's surprising to me that 30 years into it, I'm still dealing with the exact same set of challenges. So probably means I must not be a very good consultant after all if we're still solving things 30 years later. But I think it's just a universal set of challenges that we've got to continuously try to overcome.
And Bristlecone, it's an interesting name because the bristlecone pine is one of the oldest living organisms on the planet, with some of the bristlecone trees being over 4,000 years old. Is that related to the company name? Is like that a subtle nod to resilience? Is it like an apt metaphor for building supply chains that stand the test of time? Or is that just a coincidence?
No, it's not a coincidence at all. It was a very purposeful naming of the organization. It's, as you pointed out, very old and very resilient. It survives fires. It's an amazing organism. And I think you're exactly right that it speaks to the resiliency of our organization and the resiliency that we try to support our clients achieve.
Let's dig into the subject matter for today's podcast. We're going to be talking a little bit about, obviously supply chains, sustainability, and AI, I think is probably the topic du jour, really. In your work, have you seen a shift in AI discussions from education, bringing people up to speed on what it is, towards more implementation? And if so, what does that look like on the ground for companies who are rolling out AI solutions in their supply chains?
Yeah, that's a really good phrasing of the question and exactly the type of transition that we see AI going through. Conversations a year or two ago were all about education, especially in the executive suite. Every CIO, every chief supply chain officer needed to be able to understand what AI was and be able to explain it to their peers in the C suite. So there were lots of small experimental projects, and often they were assigned a little SWAT team in the IT organization to go and figure out what AI was. What we now are seeing increasingly is that AI has become more a challenge around what do we implement, how do we implement it, what do we start with. So I think folks have gotten over the hump of the basic understanding of what generative AI is. And we should talk about the difference between AI and generative AI, because I think that is one part of
Mm,
education that hasn't really broken through yet.
sure.
But folks are now shifting into the how do I do something with AI that is meaningful and has value. If I pushed a little further on that, I would say a year ago, I never heard the phrase use case associated with AI. It was more experiment, learning, right? And so people were just kind of throwing various AI tools against the wall and seeing what stuck. And now they're being much more orchestrated and structured in their approach to thinking about AI. So, one of the things that Bristlecone has developed is a series of 78 supply chain specific use cases. And we are systematically running through those 78 use cases and deploying them both internally as examples or specifically with clients. They are real and meaningful and span everything from analysis through implementation and testing, and even tackling areas as large and complex as sales and operations planning. And that's a conversation that we weren't having a year ago for sure.
And seeing as you brought it up, talk to me about how you define the difference between AI and generative AI, because AI is a very broad term encompassing all kinds of things. So, yeah, walk me through your interpretation of that.
Sure. I think in just casual conversation, when somebody says AI, what they really are thinking about is generative AI, right? The stuff that hit the news 2 years ago now with Chat GPT. So AI quickly became shorthand for a computer that does something that looks like thinking. Whereas AI at its most basic really is just, it has some sort of automated learning component to it. And so
Mm,
AI has been around for 50 or 60 years in terms of a machine learning capability. It hasn't been able to write stories or create poetry or really have a human like conversation until we got to the generative part. But it is important that when we're talking about deploying AI in a company's supply chain, which capabilities are we actually talking about? Are we talking something that's programmatical machine learning, or are we actually talking about generating net new content? They're both applicable, they're both important, but they do
mhm.
drive different use cases, different capabilities, different tactics.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, things like autocorrect is very simple AI, or the ability of digital cameras these days to isolate faces and focus on them specifically. That's AI as well. So, yeah, there are all kinds of computer vision, natural language speech processing. The spectrum of different types of AI, as I said at the start, is enormous. So, yeah, I can see, and they'd all have different potential use cases in supply chain. Generative AI, I can see some great uses for that in things like call centers, for example. That's one great use case for it. I'm sure there are hundreds more, but that's one. I was listening to a podcast about that this morning, so that's just why that came to mind straight away.
I was using Copilot the other day to help me co-author a white paper on tariffs, right? And so I
Mm,
didn't just turn the whole thing over to Copilot and expect
sure.
a white paper to get generated, but I did iterate over and over again in terms of laying out the agenda, starting to populate some basic content in different paragraphs. That's something that required some interesting skill sets on my part on learning how to iterate with Copilot, being conscious of the type of insight that Copilot either was able to or limited in what it could generate on my
Mm,
behalf. So those are, all sorts of interesting use cases with generative AI specific to the supply chain now.
yeah, I often use the different generative AIs to fact check each other. So, for
Mhm.
example, if I'm in ChatGPT and I'm asking it to help me craft a bit of text, if it comes up with some fact, inverted commas, I'll generally take the fact over to Copilot and said, I read this somewhere. Is it true? And if so, give me the sources. Those kind of things can be useful as well.
Yeah, interesting. It doesn't even have to be factually incorrect. It could just be incomplete. So, for example, this tariff paper that I was working on, right, and I asked it to pull up some of the news articles about the sudden resolution between the United States and Mexico. And
Right.
it gave a very economic textbook kind of answer, and it really didn't bring up the fact that the real resolution was Mexico agreed to put some police on the border. What Copilot told me wasn't wrong, but it was
Mm.
incomplete. So you're exactly right. Companies do have to understand the data sources and have processes in place to validate and check and be really confident in a way that we always have had to check and validate and be confident. But when it was, your supply chain planner, you had a different level of understanding about their background and, the processes they used. Generative AI is just still a little bit of a black box for most of us and
Yeah.
hard to understand and trace back how it got to some of its answers. So, big risk there for organizations to turn too much over to it at this point.
True, true. And with all the buzz around it, how do you separate genuine opportunities or use cases for transformation from the kind of overhyped features that might not deliver real value?
Well, the good news is that all of these more sophisticated use cases require a lot of the same basic preparations. And so while some of the noise, right, is settling down and we're trying, we can start to have some early experimentation to show where there really is value. The prep steps all need to happen, and companies can go ahead and be investing in those now while they wait to see which early bets are going to pan out. So, what do I mean by that? There's a series of culture and training and skills that need to be developed for AI to be leveraged at scale, regardless of what use case we're talking about. There's a series of data readiness activities that need to be undertaken, regardless of what use cases, right, we're eventually going to be talking about, right? If you've got lots of different versions of your vendor master in your system, it would be really hard to be confident in letting machine run, a strategic sourcing or a contracting program within your procurement organization,
Hmm.
right? So there's people readiness, there's data readiness that are all good investments, regardless of which specific use case. Then to actually answer your question, right, which use case we're talking about, right? It's a matter of the same sort of prioritization that we've done back when we were trying to figure out where we were going to do any customization around our SAP deployments. What's the effort and what's the benefit? And so things that were lower effort, higher benefit, you prioritized. No magic here, right? We have to do the same sort of thinking around sequencing the AI use cases. I would say, though, one of the differences is because of the amount of underlying prep around people and around data that need to take place, that anytime that you can start to lump, to use a not attractive term, but anytime you can start to group those use cases in a particular function or a particular department, you can essentially pilot in a more effective way than having a scattershot approach and having, half a dozen use cases that span planning or procurement or logistics or manufacturing and not necessarily getting enough volume of insight to really be able to apply at scale in your organization. It is both the old fashioned, what's my risk and reward and effort, and is there a way that I can group them so that I can have some real learnings in my organization before I start to deploy more widely.
Okay. And you mentioned sales and operations planning a while ago as a potential use case. So talk to me a little bit about AI's role in SNOP for, I don't know, better collaboration and scenario planning. Do you have any examples of where AI driven SNOP changed decision making for the better and how that impacted sustainability outcomes, maybe, seeing as this is the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast?
Yeah, so I actually see SNOP as one of the most requested use cases for companies that are on that early adoption wave. Because SNOP is time consuming, uses a lot of data, right? And because we're talking about global data across multiple processes, across your supplier and distribution network. And there's a lot of, probably thousands of decisions that go
Mm.
into every SNOP cycle. So we're not at the point, nor do I think we ever really get to a point where you have like a big easy button, you say, give me my SNOP, give me my plan. But what we are seeing people do across multiple industries now, including whether it's consumer packaged goods or automotive or manufacturing, we are seeing AI used as a facilitator in that SNOP process. Actually, one company that we're working with in life sciences, they had 250 custom reports on top of their SAP implementation to support SNOP. Right, that was before AI came into the picture. That was, accumulated over years of using SAP to run their planning. And those 250 custom reports were analyzed by, I don't know, call it a dozen supply planners or planners across the globe. And they then used their insights from the manual review of those custom 250 reports to come in with a point of view to influence the SNOP. Now those 250 reports are being loaded into ChatGPT, and we are gaining insights in seconds as opposed to days. And they're
Mm.
still being validated, they're still being reviewed, they're still getting a human approval on, right, the insight. But that was a massive savings in effort and time with really not much effort at all, right? You just have to load those reports right up into your enterprise chat GPT and ask it a couple of questions, and you've got some really interesting insight. Similar insights that those planners eventually would have gotten to, but if you can take a dozen planners over 5 days, that's a pretty big cost savings times what, 12 times a year. So it's out there and it's being used. Now, eventually AI will play even larger roles in SNOP, but that's what we're seeing like in action today in real boardrooms around the world.
And Jen, sustainability tends to be quite horizontal across organizations and across all supply chain decisions. And maybe because of that, it's not often the primary motivator. So, in what situations do you see sustainability actually driving the conversation, if any? And how can leaders make that more common?
Yeah, so good question. And in fact, one I personally struggle with as a consulting leader. Should there be a sustainability practice or should it be a capability, right, that is integrated into planning, into procurement, into operations? And I could probably go either way. I keep consistently going back to the capability and the horizontal because I do think that is how most of the clients that we interact with view it, with the exception of those few that have responsibility for reporting around sustainability, right? There's obviously some portions of the organization that are dedicated to sustainability. But yeah, you're exactly right. Sustainability is something that is taken into account with virtually every sourcing decision, right? It is one or multiple questions, right, on every evaluation when you're thinking about acquiring or adding a new vendor to your portfolio, in vendor performance reports, in deciding where you're going to build your new plant, and you're looking at, transportation costs, and it's a lot easier to have stuff near shore than, and actually that's a really timely question with getting back to the tariff comment that I made earlier. So yeah, so sustainability gets into every supply chain decision. I think that with AI, we have an opportunity actually to pull up that sustainability insight because we don't have to kick off another big separate analysis project to give us some insight on what is better or worse for the environment, what is better or worse for sustainability. And so hopefully that gives us some broader application and consideration of sustainability. So I'm not sure if that really answered your question, but and maybe that's indicative of how a lot of companies still struggle with
Mm.
sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, companies always look closely at ROI.
Yeah.
So, how do you make the financial case for sustainability initiatives when the payback isn't always immediate or straightforward?
Yeah, I think in some industries, the customer pushes that, right? So I've got two college age daughters, for example, and they're both very into fashion and very into doing the right thing for the earth, right? And so for them, it's actually an active, high priority consideration where they purchase their clothing from, whether or not they're doing their Amazon deliveries on a daily, when I want it basis, or having them shipped weekly. There are some consumers and some industries that really are the driving force in that. And I think in other cases, it just makes business sense, right? It is less expensive to use a lighter weight cardboard to ship
Mm.
those packages. And so I think that we should continue to look for those win wins where there's a sustainability win and a cost savings or an efficiency win. And they're out there. We just need to make sure that we're putting the right focus on it so that we bother to go looking for those types of answers.
Mm. And you mentioned tariffs, for example. I think people in supply chain at the moment, particularly in the US or Canada or Mexico or China, I think they must be feeling a certain amount of whiplash from the way these tariffs come and go.
Yeah.
With the likes of regulations and incentives shifting so quickly, especially as the political landscapes change, how do you future-proof supply chain strategies so they remain viable and sustainable under different administrations or policy frameworks?
Yeah. So actually, one of the early use cases that we had talked about, very simple AI use case, was just using AI to look at changing regulations around the world and
Mm,
essentially outsource some of that research to a bot rather than an intern. I I think in under the current U.S. administration, it takes a little more focus than a bot, right, to
mm,
respond. I mean, because it's kind of like whoever spoke to Trump last, right, has a has undue influence, and it's not just Mexico and Canada anymore, right? As of now,
mm,
the tariffs on steel globally, right? So it's literally everybody is now caught under this regulatory whiplash, to use your apt phrase. So, what does that mean that you as an organization can do to minimize the impact? If you're a manufacturer, you can't be dependent on just China. So, your China plus one strategy all of a sudden becomes much more important. But it's not even just that India or Costa Rica can be a sufficient second choice. I do think that part of what's driving these current waves of tariffs are to push more manufacturing back to the United States. So it's not just multiple sources, it's not just nearshoring. I do think there is an intent to drive it back to American based manufacturing. That will take some time, and whether or not everybody buys into that or they just assume that there'll be another news topic of the day next year or next month, I don't know. But I do think that companies owe their investors a second and third look around what their global sourcing strategies are, whether or not it's for procurement or for actual manufacturing. It probably makes good sense to revisit that anyways periodically. It's just more front and center right now with all the news.
And when you're talking to companies about AI enabled sustainability, what misconceptions are the biggest? Well, what are the biggest misconceptions you encounter when you're talking to them from executives, and how do you address those doubts?
The number one would be that sustainability costs money and I'm only doing it because it's required. So sustainability doesn't cost money. Sustainability, if you can think about things in terms of a more holistic approach, sustainability could and should actually save you money and make you
Mm,
more effective and efficient in the long run. I mean,
mm,
efficiency and effectiveness have long been the foundations of a successful supply chain, and that's exactly what drives sustainability. So I don't. I just think that sustainability sometimes has a bad rap of being a PR tactic or just for regulatory requirements. So putting the focus back on efficiency and effectiveness gets us more directly back to making that return on investment argument.
Mm. I would add resilience to that as well.
Mm, I agree. I think that's fair.
For people listening who are overwhelmed by AI's potential, you mentioned 76 use cases, if I remember correctly. What's one pragmatic first step they can take today to move their supply chain toward a more data driven, sustainable model?
Yeah, so in terms of use cases, I think using AI to look at some of your existing reporting, as I described the early SNOP adopter, that's not a bad, easy, low overhead opportunity. I think the more important preparatory activity, though, is to really go back and look at the types of resources that you have in your organization and the skills that they have, because interacting with generative AI is different than being an analyst who runs a report. There's a degree of creative thinking, of critical analysis, and we were talking about testing the content, and that an analyst who generally is collecting data and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet hasn't really been developing or practicing or using a lot in
Mm.
their careers. And those resources are pretty important to most companies' supply chains today. But fast forward 5 or 8 years, and those skills pretty replaceable by generative AI or even just the old fashioned AI. So I think that companies really need to start thinking about the types of resources they hire, the types of skills that they train for, and it's got to be leaning much more heavily towards creative analytical thinkers and not so much on rote analysts who are creating reports for the bosses. That's a big transformation that most manufacturing companies are going to have to struggle with here in the next couple of years.
Sure. We've been talking so far about generative AI. We've mostly referred to ChatGPT or
Yeah.
Copilot. Have you come across anyone using DeepSeek yet? I know it's a bit early, but it has to have massive advantages given that it's open source and it's far less needing of GPUs. So it's entirely possible to set it up in your own IT organization, train it on your own data, and not be giving your data to OpenAI for their ChatGPT models.
Yeah, so not DeepSeek in particular, but I think what roiled the market so much, right, when the news came out was that it opened up everybody's eyes to how much less intensive generative AI could be
Mm,
and how the barriers to entry are actually a little lower than maybe the original generative AI organizations would have let us believe. So, does this open up generative AI to more competitors? Absolutely. Does it make it more open? For sure. I don't know that it's going to be DeepSeek in particular, but I think it was just the first to put a chink in the wall of
mm,
the current leaders. And it's getting some of the technologists in generative AI as opposed to me, like the users and
mm.
the, coming at it from a business angle. It shows that there probably will be dozens of different AI players out there as opposed to a handful. Obviously, there's lots of different applications, whether or not you're writing stuff or doing analysis work or doing PowerPoint presentations, right? I think one recent report I saw the other day said that the average Fortune 1000 company had over 90 different AI tools in their organization already. So it's not just Chat GPT and some of the ones that we continually cite. There's lots and lots that are out there already.
Yeah, sure, sure. So, looking ahead, what emerging tech or trend do you believe could be the next real disruptor in supply chain sustainability and why?
Yeah, I just think everybody's sourcing strategies are going to be greatly impacted by the combination of thinking about sustainability from a business case perspective, trying to manage the risks around the next 4 years of Trump administration and the various tariffs. Obviously, it's a hammer in his tool belt that he's going to use. I think sourcing just floats to the top in an immediate application for me of where we can leverage AI to drive better sustainability and resiliency. And as long as companies are keeping the focus on efficiency and effectiveness, it's an easy business case to make.
Sure, 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 sure. Left field question. If you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as a spokesperson for supply chain sustainability and AI in that, who would it be and why?
Oh my goodness. A spokesperson for sustainability AI. My usual go-to answer, like anybody you want to have dinner with, right, is John Steinbeck. He's my favorite author of all time. It's both entertaining to read his books and they really make you think. I'm not sure how he would feel about generative AI and sustainability, although he worked a lot and wrote a lot around farming. He tells a great anecdote in East of Eden about the first shipping of lettuce cross country in rail cars. And the ice all melted. And so when the lettuce got there, it was obviously not fit for sale. And that's a story that stuck with me in that East of Eden. It was an allegory for some larger themes in the book. So I wonder what he would do with AI and how that would change his lettuce story and advent of
Hmm.
some of the early farming and agriculture inventions that he wrote about in the 1800s. I don't know that he'd be my spokesperson, but that's what, I think he might have some interesting thoughts about it.
Yeah. Yeah, you just reminded me there of Kurt Vonnegut, and I wonder what he would have made of this. That'd be an interesting conversation for sure. We are coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question, Jen, that I didn't ask that you wish I did, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
We didn't talk a lot about what the big enterprise application vendors are doing here in this
Hmm.
space. And that is where I see a lot of our clients who aren't naturally early adopters. I keep hearing from them questions or even the comment, I'm going to wait on SAP, or I'm going to wait on Kinaxis, or I'm going to wait on whatever their application vendor is. That's an interesting, I mean, it's a perfectly valid approach depending on your industry, or your culture, and how aggressive or conservative your organizations typically is. So I think keeping an eye on Joule with SAP, we're working closely with them on developing a lot of supply chain specific use cases in Joule. I do think that will help drive a lot of adoption because it will become innate in the applications that they've already deployed, right? It'll just come along with your S4 deployment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I thought it was interesting to see Larry Ellison of Oracle standing up at the Stargate announcement in the White House there a couple of weeks back. So be fascinating to see what Oracle come out with as well.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother podcast, I think. So, Jen, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Bristlecone.com. You can find me and our whole leadership team there. A lot of interesting thought leadership content around sustainability and AI, and obviously supply chain. So, uh, and it brings us back to your question about what Bristlecone was named after. So I'll just leave it bristlecone.com.
Perfect. Great. Jen, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.